Well, I'd like to thank you for coming out and having an interest in learning about the Oneida boarding school. Actually, it was initially called the Government Indian School at Oneida, but here in Oneida we call it Oneida Boarding School. It was one of the few, the first boarding school built on the reservation. My name is Reggie Doxtater. I'm the historical archivist, and I'm part of the history department along with Eliza Skenador and Josh Grzitich. You get that right?
Yeah, that's pretty good. I wouldn't have dared that.
So I'm glad you're all here. What we found out is the Oneida boarding school is actually on the location of Norbert Hill. That's the actual site. And we'll get into some pictures throughout the PowerPoint. The boarding school says it started in 1892. It started construction in 1892 and actually opened up March of 1893. It was only in operation from 1892 to 1919, and then it laid idle from 1919 to 1924. That's when it was converted into the Guardian Angel Boarding School. Until
is that
54.
But Indian kids didn't go there then. That was all.
Very few went to the Guardian Angel.
Yeah, it was all kids from Milwaukee and places. I thought it wasn't Indian kids.
Orphan children, from my understanding.
Yeah.
So.
But Oneida's worked there.
That I didn't do a lot of the research yet, but.
I mean, just reading about the school, I remember. Maybe not, but that's what I picked up.
So in 1953 to 1976, it was known as the Sacred Heart Seminary. Thus, that's how we got the Seminary Road. And then in 76, discussions talked with the tribe about the tribe reacquisitioning the property, and it actually happened in 1984. During the whole time, it was under the Catholic diocese. Mr. Pratt, yes.
I was going to say, did they buy it or just take it?
They ended up negotiating. The Catholic diocese was asking $1 million. Actually, they valued it at, or they had appraised it at 1.1 million. And
Well,
then they were asking.
how did they get it from? Didn't it belong to the tribe before?
How did it
When it was
transition
still an
to?
Indian boarding school?
Oh,
And then it closed down?
it closed down in June of 1919, and then it was idle, but there was a lot of articles, a lot of tribal members were fighting to keep the school and turn it into an agricultural school or an engineering school, to no avail. They went to Washington, they went to the state senator, they went to Madison, everyone they could put articles in the paper and stuff, and they still couldn't get it back within our control. So then there was a company that will get discussed in here that purchased it for $23,000, and then they turned around and sold it to the diocese for $1. So that's it's kind of interesting. So Pratt is the founder. He's a military officer. He's the one that created the Carlisle boarding school, and he coined the phrase "kill the Indian, save the man" through assimilation and Christianity, and that kind of went all the way through all of the boarding schools with the structure, military structure, with the education. Reverend Goodnow was within the boundaries, working with the church and the Indian agent, Thomas Jennings, and he had actually initiated the conversation for getting a school on the Oneida reservation, to no avail. until Father Burleson came in 1891. He actually went to Washington D.C. and he ran into a couple of a good friend of his that worked in the Commission of Indian Affairs, and he convinced him and negotiated and got the approval for the boarding school to be built on the Oneida Reservation. What's interesting about Burleson coming in here, because if you know a little bit about the allotment map, there's a designated area for a government school that's already on there. The allotment map was done in 1891. So there was already pre-planning in a location for the school that was already done before the school was even approved. So that's kind of the research that I'd like to find more on. The Indian agents for Oneida actually ended up being the school superintendent for the boarding school, and there was only two. Joseph Pierce was the first superintendent of the school from 1892 to 1900, and then Joseph Hart came in from 1900 to 1919 when the school closed, and he was actually reassigned out to Flanders. Before the boarding school even started, there were 6 day schools scattered throughout the reservation. That was kind of interesting because some of the research that I found with funding listed that they paid for each of the day schools and the teachers that taught at the schools. So there were 6 of them. A day school is just like what public school is today. You go during the day, you go home at night. And they were actually held in private homes of some tribal members, some non-tribal. That's the list of the day schools and the teachers that taught at them in the year that they taught. One of the more popular names that we know is just Josiah Paulus, both at day school 2 and 4 in the time frame. So that was actually before he was a doctor. The day schools varied in how many enrolled students that attended, depending on where they lived on the reservation, is where they kind of attended the day school. This is the allotment map, and like I was saying, that in 1891, the yellow circle there, shows exactly where the government boarding school was located, and that's where Norbert Hill Center is right now. We'll have pictures of how they built around the old buildings of the boarding school. So it originally is 80 acres that was allotted to the school. And George Doxtater, right where that reflection was, had an allotment right next to it, just north of it, and he actually sold 38.71 acres additionally to the boarding school for farming. Originally there was 3 to 4 buildings that was built. Their initial plan was for 80 students to attend the boarding school. By the time they built the original buildings in 1893, they had overpopulated the school. So they built more buildings, more dormitories, and the population increased, or the roster increased to 225 students in 1907. This is an aerial photo of the boarding school campus. We're estimating it's about 1950. Most of the buildings were still there. some of the reports that came in from the Indian agent or the superintendent. The buildings were falling apart, they needed updates, and actually in some of the research that we found, they were actually talking about getting rid of the boarding school as early as 1915. So it was already in the works for closing it. Some of the buildings, the superintendent building is the building on the lower left, or middle left. The assembly hall is right next to it. The building in the back. This is the superintendent's house. This is the assembly hall. This is the day room for staff, eventually. This was the infirmary. These were the main three that were built early, the first buildings in the boarding school. These buildings were later added on, and this is the gymnasium that was later added in almost right before it closed. This is the girls' dorm, and then classrooms. We're not really sure. This is possibly a guest room for visitors.
Seminary Road?
Seminary Road would be right here. Right here.
Okay.
What was the name of it then?
Boarding School Road.
No, that was first, second ridge, right?
Second Ridge?
Yeah.
Oh,
Mhm.
sorry.
The faculty, this is a picture right before they closed, 1918, 1919. It was a mixed between non-tribal and tribal. The superintendent hired all of the staff, and the one person that we do know, this is Dr. Josiah Paulus. We're not sure of who else is in the photo. We can assume there's a nurse standing on the right with a nurse hat. But so they had quite a big staff. It was a mix. The superintendent was in charge, and they had a clerk, 5 clerk over the years, an assistant clerk, matrons, assistant matrons, physician, which they didn't have every year. They only had it sporadically. A nurse, disciplinarian, which was interesting. Teachers, assistant teachers. When Joseph Hart initially came in 1900, his wife was known as the principal teacher. Surprise. They had a kindergarten. That was surprising. A laundress, assistant laundress, seamstress, assistant cook, a baker. I wouldn't have thought they had all that, but the years afterwards is when they initiated hiring of those positions. The tribal and non-tribal means that they were both hired for tribal and non-tribal as teachers or instructors. They had a farmer, dairyman, carpenter, assistant engineer, industrial, because it was known as an agricultural industrial school. They even had night watchmen and firemen and laborers. So quite a big staff over the years. The students that attended, it says 8 to 14. There are stories that some that went there earlier. They went for 10 months out of the year, and there's a picture of what was graduation day. Well, not really graduation, but going home day. And they were given three uniforms: the work, school, and Sunday best. The students, the older girls that attended the school, created all of the uniforms for the students, male and female. The daily routine in the classroom, half of the day was in classroom, half of the day was in The areas, the farming, the gardening, they actually had a garden, seamstress, laundress, cooking. They kind of did a work study. What I found interesting about the daily routine in the education is it went up to 5th or 6th grade, and I always heard that our grandparents went up, well, we only had to go up to 8th grade. Well, the 8th grade at that time, if you think of it not as high school and public education now, where you're a certain age and you're in this grade, at this time it's more like college. So if you were studying a certain field, you were in there, and it didn't matter what your age was. Because in 4th or 5th grade, you could have anyone from 10 to 14 years old. Very interesting time frame with that education practices. Picture of the dining room and the cooking area. The dining room was in the assembly hall. Seamstress and laundry, which they'd go down to the creek and get the water for the laundry. Light and boiler plant, and the pupils garden. All of the pictures that we have here are taken from Ed Kruger, that was hired as a financial clerk in 1911. Without him being hired, we would have never had any of these pictures. This is the going home day. End of the school session in May, and there was a picnic was provided for the students and families that attended the school. That Seminary Road, that was kind of across the street where everybody waited and had the picnic. Dr. Josiah Paulus, he was a student at the boarding school. He was an assistant teacher, an assistant industrial teacher, day school teacher, as we mentioned prior, a teacher and physician. We also know that Nancy Cornelius was a nurse that also worked at the boarding school, only for a few years. But in between 1900 and 1906 is when he went and got his medical degree and became a physician. With some of the documentation that we received or we found in the National Archives down in Chicago, we found a register of all of the teachers, and that's coming up on slides, so after year we won't go through those. But it's interesting to see the variation in wages. Non-tribal was way higher than what tribals received. What was lost from students attending the boarding school? Language, culture, tradition, a sense of belonging, and family unity. And that was the whole design of the boarding schools with Pratt. This is the aerial of the Guardian Angel Boarding School. You can see how the Norwood Hill Center now is being built right around the old boarding schools. The buildings, they tore some down, some are being built around the old buildings. So it's kind of interesting to see Norwood Hill now and picture that you'd be actually walking through the dormitory of the girls right in the front walkway.